Thank you for coming along this rather damp Sunday evening and at the start of conference. My name is James Groves. I'm Head of Education at Policy Exchange, and today basically we are posing the question, the student experience: how can universities meet the expectations of an increasingly demanding student body? And on the eve of the Brown Review, with the very real possibility that the cap on fees will increase, students are becoming, whether we like it or not, even more so regarded as consumers. How therefore are the universities going to step up to the plate and meet the expectations of this increasing demand? And we have an experienced panel here this evening to address that very question. On my far right, we have Nicola Dandridge, who's the Chief Executive of Universities UK. My immediate right, we have Sean O'Shea, who's the Chief Executive of UPP, and who are sponsoring and working with us in this event. To my immediate left, we have David Willetts, Minister for Science and Universities, and Aaron Porter is, I'm told, on his way from the train station as we speak, so he will join us at that point. Perhaps if we could, each of the panelists could maybe speak for 5-10 minutes, and then we'll have a few questions and answers and take it from there. Nicola, can I pass across to you?
Thank you very much, James. I'm going to answer this question in two ways. Firstly, I will touch on the ways in which universities are already meeting the expectations, the quite legitimate expectations of students, and then I want to move on to the exam question, which is how can we sustain that meeting of expectations in an environment of fiscal cuts and cuts to higher education. And it's that second question which clearly is the difficult one, and the one that all of us need to be able to answer. But first of all, I thought I should just let you know who I am and who Universities UK is. We are the representative body for all universities in the United Kingdom. So we have 134 members, 134 members, one university, one member across the whole of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So I speak very much from the perspective of universities. So the first question, to what extent are universities already meeting increasingly demanding student expectations? And I think it's worth reminding ourselves here that the student body is larger and more diverse than ever before, and because in part they have been paying graduate contributions, are becoming increasingly demanding, and certainly from the university's perspective that is welcome. But just in terms of the size, bear in mind that enrolments have increased by 28% over the last 10 years. That's a huge expansion, and with that expansion there's kind of greater diversity. We now see far more part-timers than ever before. For example, over 40% of students are part-time. More mature students, I was reading the other day a statistic of over 60% are over 21, and much more diverse in terms of ethnicity, and increasing numbers of participation by disabled students and so on and so forth, as well, of course, as the increasing number of international students. So however you look at it, this is a very diverse body, and to the extent that the numbers are very large, universities are already meeting diverse demands and diverse needs. And I think parallel with all of that, their offer is becoming increasingly diversified, and it's fascinating to look at the way the curriculum changes have reflected student demands. So, for example, a growth in subjects like mass communications, architecture, building and planning, education, maths is increasing, creative arts and so on and so forth. And I think the way that the courses and the undergraduate provision is morphing, if you like, is a reflection of the demands of students who are voting with their feet in terms of going and participating in certain courses. Against that background of increasing diversity, we have the NSS results, the National Student Survey results, and I think we need to place this right at the beginning of this debate, because students are telling us through the NSS that they are overwhelmingly satisfied with the quality of teaching that's provided by universities. The statistic is at the moment 82% of students are satisfied overall. Now within that there are concerns about feedback and so on and so forth, but I think it's worth premising this whole debate with that statistic that overwhelmingly students are pretty satisfied with what goes on. Now, that sounds like we're being incredibly complacent, and I think that could not be further than the truth. There's a huge amount that we need to do in terms of improving the quality of tuition, and far more we need to do in terms of meeting absolutely legitimate expectations. But let's not lose sight that basically this is a pretty good story. One further point in terms of just looking at where we are at the moment, and I just want to touch on this question of graduate contributions, because we can't look at this issue without talking about funding, as James has already flagged up. Graduate contributions, currently just over £3,000, are paid by graduates when they earn over a certain threshold and not by students. The majority of teaching funding still comes from the state. But I think it's worth just noting that graduate contribution has injected about 1.3 billion into the system, and that has been used in ways which have met student demands and expectations in large part. There is this narrative that goes, graduate contributions went on staff pay and pensions, and that's quite simply not true. The facts are as follows. Over 25% of student bursaries, according to research that we've done at UK, went on bursaries and grants to poorer students. A very significant proportion went on improving the infrastructure, went on sports facilities, IT upgrades, improving the estate, and so on. And in terms of the element that went to staff pay, that actually increased the numbers of staff, so that the staff-student ratio has improved, and increasing numbers of staff are playing roles in terms of student support, and a whole gamut of advice services such as careers advice and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at what impact the graduate contributions have had, it's not a negative story that somehow those contributions are sunk into the coffers of universities, never to be seen again. We have evidence, we've produced reports which shows a much more nuanced account of income coming in to diversify and improve the student experience. But briefly and quickly, moving to the exam question, which is how can universities do more of this? How can we meet increasing demands from students? And although I referred to the National Student Survey being overwhelmingly positive, I think that there is a real acknowledgement with universities that we've got to do more, that the feedback we're getting about quality of feedback, for example, from teachers to students is not good enough, and we have got to improve, and somehow we've got to do that with less. Now, we do know that, so there's absolutely no complacency. But I think also there's other things we need to do which would shape the way we respond to those demands. First of all, I think we need to find out much more clearly what the demands of students are. There's a great diversity of expectations. Not all students want the same thing, and we've got to be better at understanding that dynamic. And that means better work at IAG, better engagement with students, and that's quite a complex three-part dialogue between students, often through their representative, the NUS, with students at school, and with existing students, and also the schools themselves. We've just got to wrap that communication package up so that we're more effective in finding out what it is that students want. Secondly, I think we've got to be far better, the universities, at communicating the range of provision that is available, and let students know in a much more informed way what their choices are. Just briefly, by way of illustration, I just happened to be at Heathrop College this week, which is part of the University of London. 900 students, it's tiny. They specialise in training Jesuit priests. Now, I'd never heard of it before until I joined the UK. It's a little gem of a college. If you want to study theology, and preferably theology and philosophy from a Catholic viewpoint, it is the place to go. How many students know that at school? I bet very, very few. Likewise, the same week I went to the University of West of England, a massive vocationally orientated primarily teaching institution with a strong bent towards vocational based research, with links with Hewlett-Packard, with, they've got a joint robotics centre with the University of Bristol. They've got over 30,000 students. I mean, a completely different sort of excellence to Heathrop College. And is that diversity well communicated to students in schools? I think not. I think we've got to do far more to make sure that students are making the choices that are right for them. Over the summer, during the admissions debacle, when there was so much publicity in August about students not getting places, I was being interviewed alongside someone one of these straight A students who hadn't got a place. And they were obviously extremely able, but they'd applied to Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, Edinburgh, and one other I can't remember. But I was just reflecting, who gave them that advice only to apply to those universities? That's bad advice. Did they not know about insurance options? But also, did they not think that there was anywhere else within the whole panoply of the higher education sector which might suit them? And this is an important point, because if we're not communicating effectively, then students are going to make the wrong choices. And this goes back to the exam question, which is, what can we do to meet the demands of students? And I think really the fundamental thing here is we've got to make sure that students better understand the range of options that are available to them. Finally, my final point is you simply cannot address this point without looking at funding, because how can we do much more for much less? It's absolutely clear that universities have got to take their share of public funding cuts, and we've never said otherwise within Universities UK. But cut us too far and we simply cannot meet legitimate student expectations. And our real concern is that there is an expectation that the Brown Review will introduce a new funding regime whereby graduate contributions will to some extent, in some way, compensate for cuts that appear in the spending review, and those cuts will be anticipated in the spending review itself. But this is our concern. What if the cuts are made to the comprehensive spending review figure for higher education, but then Brown can't be delivered for political reasons? Then we get seriously cut, and either the number of students has to decline dramatically, or the quality of the student experience has to decline dramatically. And both of those, in Universities UK's view, but I think in the view of the larger populace, and certainly in terms of the student populace, that would be very, very damaging for students, damaging for this country and for our path out of the recession, because whatever else this country needs, it's going to need skilled graduates in the future. So, to summarise, diverse demands to some extent already met. We're not complacent, but overall the picture that we're getting back from students is broadly positive. There's a tremendous amount of diversity of provision. We've got to do far more in communicating that and communicating it more effectively. We've got to ensure a better match between students' demands and what's provided to them, and don't cut funding, otherwise we will all suffer, but particularly students. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Nicola. Sean, UPP, and what are UPP doing to help universities meet this increasing expectation?
Well, hopefully we will be providing private sector funding without recourse to the public purse to enhance the overall level of the student experience.
Yeah.
Thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. In the first instance, I'd like to thank Policy Exchange for giving me this opportunity to share a platform with my fellow speakers. This afternoon, what I'd like to do is outline the areas that I think are the most important ways in which universities, and indeed all of us, can meet the expectations of students to enhance their overall experience. As it's been mentioned, over the last decade, the higher education sector has enjoyed increased levels of public investment. That equates to about 40% in real terms. And it also includes significant investment in capital expenditure, which has increased by 300% over the same period. As we all know, Nicola mentioned, for the forthcoming year, well over £500 million of cuts have already been introduced, with total capital grants for 2010-2011 being some £250 million lower than expected. However, on a more positive note, amongst the investment community, UK universities are now being viewed as an asset class in their own right. They do contribute some £60 billion to the UK economy. Universities are strong and stable institutions that produce predictable income streams. And I would actually argue that it's critical, therefore, that universities seeking to improve the quality of both core and non-core provision leverage these advantages to secure more private sector funding. This leads me on to the areas that I think that universities should focus in order to meet the expectations of their students. Firstly, the quality of the teaching, research and residential infrastructure. Secondly, the capacity of an institution to utilise its assets to the benefit of that core provision. Thirdly, listening and being more proactive to student feedback. And finally, the provision of high levels of pastoral care. So, if I talk about each one of those in turn. Firstly, the quality of the built environment undoubtedly does have a bearing on the student experience. Place and space help us define what a university is, and attractive buildings with iconic designs make students feel proud of being part of that institution. Good quality, affordable student accommodation is also an important factor. In an environment of cost reduction, capital projects tend to be the first to face the axe. However, there are some notable examples, such as the University of Exeter, who are carrying out over £300 million worth of new development, creating over 2,500 high-quality study bedrooms with my company, UPP, expanding its business school, as well as constructing academic and accommodation facilities for overseas foundation students. Majority of the funding for those projects has been raised through the private sector, without recourse to the public purse. For me, this is a real and tangible example of what can be achieved. And I would suggest that universities examine in more detail the alternative funding models available to keep their capital projects alive and provide good quality infrastructure that students will expect. Secondly, I think that universities need to work harder to get more from their existing estates for the benefit of their students. Across the UK, there are some 25 million square metres of real estate, and that costs about £1.9 billion per annum to operate. According to Hefty's Estate Management Statistics report from 2009, the utilisation of this space was only just over 26% during term time, with less than 45% of core teaching space being monitored for occupancy. For me, there is clearly room for improvement in terms of increased utilisations and efficiencies. I think that universities should deploy initiatives to increase the utilisation of their assets and hence reduce operational costs. A 20% improvement from current performance on its own would go a long way to negate the effect of the funding cuts. The benefits of these savings could then be channeled towards initiatives that, again, would enhance the student experience. Thirdly, actually listening to students. There has to be a quid pro quo between any step change of the cost of higher education and the quality of provision, both core and non-core services. This will require institutions to improve levels of responsiveness to the needs of their students. A business that actually listens and responds intelligently to its customers is a better business. And in light of the changes taking place across the sector, I think that universities need to redouble their efforts in this regard. Being more responsive to students does not necessarily cost any more money. Student surveys, focus groups, and mystery shopper exercises are all part of the way in which we at UPP gauge our own performance. The feedback we receive across our 20,000 rooms leaves us in little doubt of what students want and where things can be improved. Although the sector has recently become far more responsive to student needs, there is still further work to do. The National Union of Students still say it can take up to 12 months for universities to deal with student complaints. Clearly, this will not enhance student experience. Finally, pastoral care. Universities are well equipped to provide pastoral care services for the students, the pressures that students face, be they emotional, financial or study related. The National Audit Office indicates that those students most likely to drop out are those who fail to integrate within the first term, and this includes settling into residential accommodation. The provision of pastoral care is therefore of pivotal importance and should, I think, start prior to a student attending university. The support should continue throughout the student's stay. The cost of the provision of this service, I think, is a very worthwhile investment. We at UPP acknowledge the importance of pastoral care and recognise that universities are definitely in the best position to provide it. We assist in the process by giving discounted or free accommodation to those involved. So, to conclude, I think the sector does face a very challenging time against a background of reduced public investment, and this could adversely affect student experience. However, I believe that universities are more than able to drive through the sorts of commercial reforms that are required. I also believe that working in partnership, the utilisation of private sector investment, working the assets harder, listening to students and applying the appropriate levels of pastoral care will only enhance the student experience at a time of higher education funding cuts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. David.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm grateful to Policy Exchange for hosting this event. I agree with a lot of what our two previous speakers have said. Nicola, who speaks very eloquently for Universities UK, and Sean, talking about his responsibilities with so many students in his accommodation. I'm reminded of the great story of Conrad Hilton, who may have had even more people over the years staying in his accommodation than in UPP's. And someone said to him, now you've when he was retiring, you've had all these people in your hotel rooms for so long, you must have got some understanding of human behaviour from all this. Is there anything that you can draw, any lessons you can draw from running so many hotels? And he said, yes, there's something very important. Do remember to put the shower curtain inside the bath. Just occasionally, these sort of blinding insights come to people. Well, we're on a different theme today. Let me just get 4 points about how we should indeed quite rightly focus on improving the student experience. The first point, which Nicola has rightly talked about, is information, and there is some information already. I'm perhaps got slightly less faith in the student survey than she has, because I've had Vice Chancellors sit in my office and explain to me how you can game the student survey, and there are certainly tactics that are used, and indeed I've even met someone whose business is taking real surveys of student opinion that won't be published but are used by university management as they try to improve their product. So we can do better on information, but student surveys are a useful start. And although on average, you're right, Nicola is right, it does show quite high rankings, there are some weaknesses, especially in the more academic area, that is striking things like academic feedback, which Nicola rightly referred to. So we need to push forward on information. Secondly, as well as just pushing out the information, and we've made some steps already in the first few months, for example, HEFKI requiring information about employability performance afterwards. The second thing is some mechanisms for monitoring that and assessing it, and something that I would be very keen to see, and part of the exercise with the emergence in the John Brown Review. I do not wish to get into a situation where we have an Ofsted for universities that goes around prying into everything that happens within individual seminar rooms. But I think this is a great area where the universities themselves could come together and agree perhaps a rather more intrusive and demanding level of monitoring of each other's performance than we've got so far. Thirdly, empowering the student as customer. And although we're all waiting with bated breath as to what exactly John Brown is going to propose, it's pretty clear that whatever kind of graduate contribution we end up with is going to put more power in the hands of the individual student choosing his or her university and paying for it subsequently out of a graduate contribution. And as that happens, it means that student choice matters more, and I think that it will strengthen the hand of the student as they look for a high-quality student experience. And so although this is partly driven by sheer brutal financial pressures, I'm going to turn to them in a moment, what I want to get out of this at the end of the day, is something which is not an exercise driven simply by need to save for the exchequer, but also ends up with a regime that puts greater power and financial power in the hands of individual students. So we do end up with a better system, which is offers a better deal for students. And then the fourth thing is that for this sort of for the demand side of the equation to have real clout, it has to be matched by supply side reform. And that's one of the themes of policy exchanges work. It's something that I applied when I was shadowing education before the department was split. It's something that Michael Gove is pursuing with schools, and it equally applies with universities. It should be easier for new entrants to come in. And I can well imagine new entrants coming in that focus particularly on the teaching experience and say they're setting up new institutions or going to take over the management of institutions, which will offer which will be very much focused on the teaching experience for students. And I think that would be very good for students if that happened. And there are lots of ways this could happen. I speculated in a speech this summer on one way it could be made to happen, which is new institutions coming in as teaching institutions that teach and deliver external degrees of other institutions. They're not preoccupied with having their own degree awarding powers. They instead offer degrees, for example, for the external degrees of the University of London, which is historically how British higher education expanded between about 1850 and 1950. It was how new universities began. So you put all that together, information, monitoring, empowerment of the student as consumer, supply side reform, and I think we start tackling the challenge which we're set by policy exchange. Let me just comment very briefly on the where we are on the financing, and Aaron has come in armed with his copy of the Observer, in which he's quoted and I'm not. No, he's quoted and views are attributed to me, which may or may not be my view. But there is a kind of iron triangle here. We have got, and the reality is, whichever party won the election, is going to be financial stringency. We're going to face austerity. The question is what we do in response to it, and you can reduce the amount of funding per student, which, and to some extent, that is something universities are going to have to do, and where there are inefficiencies and ways they can improve their performance, quite rightly, they should go down that route. There are limits to how much you can expect there. The second option is to have fewer students, and if the graduate contribution rises, individuals will have to take their own view, but my view is that underneath it there is a big international trend for more people to go to university, and it's hard to see that going into some dramatic reverse. So you end up with the third variable, which is expecting more from graduates after they've graduated, if they're in well-paid jobs, as a contribution. Now, there are different mechanisms that can take. It's very important that it be proportionate, that people who end up in less well-paid jobs get proper protection, people who end up in better paid jobs pay more. But Vince and I, expression I use quite a lot of them, Vince and I have together gone through this analysis, and we've both concluded that you have to look at an increase in the graduate contribution in some form or other as the best option out of those three. And the challenge for anybody who wants to kind of join in this debate is whether they agree with that or whether they would rather one of the other two variables adjust. But those are the three options. And I think anybody who cares about the long-term interests of students and universities must conclude that the graduate contribution is the best thing to do, faced with those three options. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. Aaron.
Thanks very much, James. And thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I have to say it's already refreshing compared to last week, where we have a politician that doesn't have to start their contribution with "and I'm standing for the shadow cabinet." So that's already a plus on last week. But to look at the question of how can universities meet the increasing expectations of students, well, the very simple answer would of course be to make sure you don't charge them more, because what we've seen since fees have increased, first to £1,000 in 1998 and then trebled to £3,000 in starting from 2006, was naturally student expectations did increase. when you're paying more, students will of course expect more. And a couple of people are kind of crossing their head in the audience, but I think it perfectly makes sense that if someone is paying more, then their expectations of what they will receive will of course increase. Now, in some respects, that was perfectly acceptable when the amount of money coming in from government was relatively flat over the last period. But what isn't acceptable is to ask students to pay more when what they will receive is the same or arguably less. And what we are faced with over the coming years, if students or graduates are asked to pay more, I don't see how there has been as yet any assurances of what students will receive will be any better than what they're receiving already. And on that basis, I don't see how it's acceptable to ask them to pay more. But I do accept that going into a testing financial period that we are going into, everyone is going to have to pay their fair share. That means that universities will have to accept some cuts. I do challenge the depth and the speed at which the cuts are being applied, but accepting that the Treasury have made that decision and we have a government pursuing that agenda, then of course universities are going to have to make some cuts. But I don't accept that graduates solely should have to bear the responsibility of having to bridge the gap which universities are receiving cuts in expenditure. And I think that given the record levels of investment that universities have had over the last decade, I think it's inexplicable that universities have not had the foresight to realise that they might have to have some tough times ahead. And actually, when you look at where the additional money has gone, I accept that 25% of additional top-up fee income has gone on student support, but I would say that that's perfectly, I'd expect that given that students were asked to pay more. Some of that money, only 25%, has gone on student support for the poorest students, but not all of it's gone on the poorest students. Some of it has gone on incentives for students with scholarships and so on, for students with high level grades, and actually I would much rather that money targeted towards the poorest students. But what is undeniable, during the last period when students were asked to pay more, yes, it meant that some buildings shot up, but often those students didn't actually get to benefit from those buildings that went up. But about 60% of the additional fee income did go on staff salaries. And I of course support the need for staff in higher education to be well paid and well supported. It's in students' interest for there to be good staff-student ratios. But frankly, when I go around speaking to students and tell them that 60% of their additional fee income has gone on the salaries of their staff, not very many students are particularly pleased with that response. They want to hear how their contact time has improved. They want to hear how the quality of what they received has improved. And crucially, more and more students are saying, what support was I given to get a job afterwards? Now, it's an unfortunate combination of circumstance, which means that students recently graduating from university have gone into the bleakest employment prospects in over a generation. And that does make the case for increasing fees that much tougher. And frankly, I don't think it's going to improve much over the next couple of years. Now, I think it's important to retain a medium and long-term perspective. I accept that on average, graduates still earn £100,000 more compared to those that haven't been into higher education, and it is important to bear that in mind. But that £100,000 figure is an average figure. And for someone like me, that's an arts graduate, I studied English literature, my graduate premium, how much I'm expected to earn over my working lifetime compared to someone that hasn't been to university, is just £35,000. Now, I'm not sure, I'm no more sure than anyone else on the panel, well, maybe aside from David, how likely this is to come true or not. But if it is the case, and the fees were perhaps to go up to £7,000, I think we'd be looking at average graduate debt in excess of £40,000, and £10,000 you might be looking at average graduate debt of £60,000 and upwards. Now, for those students studying arts, humanities, and some social sciences, the economic case for going to university actually starts to eliminate. And whilst I, of course, am a huge supporter of better information, advice, and guidance, why on earth would you arm someone with the information, advice and guidance to tell them that going to university to study English or history of art isn't worth it because you probably won't get the returns? That, for me, is why a market in fees won't work, because it doesn't mean that the burden is shared out equally. just want to say a couple of other quick things on information, advice and guidance. I do accept what everyone else has said, that at the point of application, students need better information about different kinds of courses, indeed different routes post-compulsory education. I do think that whilst the 50% target was helpful in that it meant more people went to university, it did prioritise progression into higher education over other routes, and I don't think that was right. And actually, I support this government's decision to kind of remove that artificial figure because it wasn't always of benefit to those at the point of application. But it has meant that given the fact that fees trebled, I don't know how it's still acceptable for 4 or 5 years down the line, universities to still be saying, well, we should be providing better information to applicants. Why wasn't it done at the time when fees are trebled? And what's the assurance that it's going to now be done in the event that fees might be asked to be greater? On the specific point that Nicola raised about a student with 4 A's at A-level applying to Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial and Edinburgh, if I have 4 A's at A-level, in truth, I don't see what's wrong with that individual wanting to go to a university where the entry requirements are 3 A's or 4 A's, because I don't see why that person should then have to apply to a university where it might be an A and 2 B's. If that person has 3 or 4 A's at A-level, I think we need to think about how we can have a more flexible system to ensure that those with high grades are actually supported to go to institutions that they want to. The final thing that I just want to finish off on is that I don't just want to be oppositional in this argument over the next few weeks and months. And we're already gearing up for what I think will be a very difficult argument. I don't believe that there is public support for fees to go up. I don't believe that David's coalition partners can in any conceivable world vote for a higher fee, given that they stood on a manifesto that said they would abolish fees, signed up to a pledge that said they would vote against fees, signed up to a coalition document that said they would take debt into consideration when anything other than anything like this means that debt would double. So, assuming all of that, I still don't want to just be oppositional. So I want to lead a national union which accepts that on average, graduates might have to pay more over the coming years. But if graduates are going to pay more, I don't accept that irrespective of what the amount that you pay should be linked to the university you go to or the course that you study. If graduates are expected to pay more, let's at least link it to the earnings, and let's at least mean that those that earn more pay more, because I just don't accept that everyone should have to leave university saddled with similar amounts of debt when what they might benefit afterwards could vary wildly. I don't think it's acceptable that the English literature graduate that went to a university like my own should be in exactly the same amount of debt as someone that becomes a high-flying lawyer or a city banker. I think that if the government are going to be brave in this circumstance, they need to link the amount that graduates pay to their earnings, because I think that's the only fair way to solve this very difficult situation. Now, I accept that what I'm going to say over the course of this conference may not be popular, but I know it's socially just and I know it's fair, and I'm going to fight all the way to make sure that it's the government are pressed on this issue, because it's a fight that they need to know that they're going to have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Very eloquently put. And so we've heard from all 4 of our panelists, from Nicola pointing out the universities are already doing quite a bit to address the demands of students, but acknowledging that more does need to be done. And Sean pointing out that capacity, we do need to improve capacity in terms of facilities, and pointing towards the role that private finance can play in this. David highlighting the supply side reform and particularly mentioning teaching experience, which is very, very interesting, and leads us on to what Aaron is pointing out about students not accepting that basically more needs to be done, and that we need to look at things like employability, and that universities haven't prepared for the tough times ahead. Perhaps I could open up to the floor and look for questions, or for any one of our panelists in particular, or for the panel as a whole. Yes, sir.
Tim Wilson, Vice-Chancellor, University of Hertfordshire, HEFCE board member, chair of the Teaching Quality and Student Experience Committee, but I'll speak as an individual. So people in the room know who I am, so let's start. I've got a few comments and a request as well. The comments really surround the information, advice and guidance issue here, because there's no doubt about it. There's the amount of information that's being supplied now to potential undergraduates is far greater than it was a few years ago, and when the next changes come through, it'll be even more extensive and quite right too. But we can't avoid the fact, and Nicola makes the point, that there's a very, very significant number of undergraduates choose which university they're going to go to without any reference whatsoever to that information. And the quality of the information advice to those young people really needs a lot to be desired, because the research shows the number of students actually looking at it is very low indeed compared to what should be given the sort of investment young people have to make. And I'll just wrap that up, if I may, with the point you made about the students with expecting to get 4As applying to 4A university. We have a UCAS system that was designed when supply exceeded demand. And we've got to look again, frankly, at a UCAS system which is designed with that in mind. Because at the moment we have an awful lot of very, very well qualified students who couldn't get into university despite the fact they had a very high level of achievement. What I'm not going to do, by the way, is talk about finance, because I don't think it's off the agenda for me at the moment. The pleas I'm going to make, the first one is, can we please look again at the definition of graduate employment? The definition of graduate employment goes back to the days when it was fashionable for graduates to go into management training programs for large retail corporates. It does not reflect the fact that a large number of students nowadays, especially those in creative arts, become self-employed. If you're self-employed, you are not under a graduate job. By the way, if you're a paramedic scientist as well, you're not a graduate, which worries me, because next time I get into an ambulance, I'd like them to have graduate skills, not be white van drivers with looking at the NHS. So let's look again at the definition, please, of graduate employment. And my final point is a plea to David. Many public universities work with the private sector. Not necessarily here in the UK, but internationally, I should think, I don't know, maybe not the majority, but a very large number of universities used to working with the private sector. And that's comfortable. It's within the quality assurance framework defined by the QAA, and it's rigorously applied. My plea is that let's have a level playing field. The private sector is welcome in this country. I will certainly welcome and work with the private sector wherever I can. But they have to comply to protect our students with the guidelines and the parameters defined by a quality assurance agency. There must be no dilution of quality at all in that context. Thank you, James. I'm more of a statement.
David, would you like to address?
Well, it's an interesting personal view, isn't it? I remember doing Any Questions once with Ian Blair when he was the head of the Metropolitan Police. I thought it was a bit odd. He turned up in his uniform to do this, to answer all these political questions. And his first answer began by saying, as the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, I'm not supposed to have a view on this question, but as Ian Blair, I do. And for every single one, he gave what he claims his personal view. And I thought, you know, this guy's he's on a tricky road. I mean, I agree with some of the things that Tim says, and I absolutely agree with him on information, advice and guidance. I think the challenge there, to be honest, as I battle on this, is to make people think of it as more than a slightly sad middle-aged man with patches over the elbows of his corduroy jacket walking up the school drive with some old prospectuses for a job at the local supermarket, which is the kind of perception of what careers advice is. And we've got and this is where I think we can do a lot more using the web and internet-based systems and social enterprises. I'm not sure I agree with Tim that when he says UCAS was designed for when supply exceeded demand. My understanding of the figures is that in the past, the percentage of applicants who got places at university was often lower than it is now. There were times when it was 50% of applicants getting a place, and it's just gone this year down from perhaps 70% of applicants getting a place to 66%, and that itself has created great controversy. But I think in reality, in the past, it was always quite competitive. And I'm checking up this graduate employment issue. I've got into this myself. I'm not totally sure it works the way you describe. I think if there are sectors of self-employment that are now heavily graduate dominated, I've had my meetings with the statisticians, and the system is changing so that if those sectors do have large numbers of graduates, the definition is supposed to adjust to reflect the choices of real individuals. But I'm working on this and I'm still trying to get to the bottom of it.
Anyone else in the panel like to comment on that question?
Well, I mean, I agree with much of what Tim said. I mean, I thought I said lots of controversial things that people would want to come back on. I mean,
Tory audience is very polite, you see.
it wasn't like this last week. The week before. I mean, the other thing I would say is, I mean, I do think also that we need to look at the graduate employment data in even more detail, which is to say that at a national level, beyond 6 months really, there is very limited data about the graduate destinations of those leaving higher education, and on that basis alone, it's really difficult to tell what happens to different graduates in different institutions. Because, and the reason I'll just make this one point. We've done a fair amount of research looking at what motivates students to come into higher education from a range of different backgrounds. And actually, the overwhelming choices in order to gain employment and to secure earnings after graduation, and actually for students from the poorest backgrounds, that's even more important for them, perhaps because they see going into higher education as a bigger financial risk. But at the moment, they don't feel confident in you looking at graduate destination data to make an informed decision about which institution to go to. And so even if they look at any data at all, what they simply really do is look at league tables by and large, or worse than that, well, if there's anything worse than league tables, is, and there's some of the Times are in the room, worse than that is sometimes the perceived, quote that Simon, is the perceived prestige of certain institutions, and actually it bears limited correlation to what happens to the graduates afterwards. And so I do think we absolutely need to, and I would happily work with the government and with universities to see how we can have a much more robust, longitudinal set of information about the graduate prospects, and I don't mean graduate jobs, I just mean what happens to graduates post-leaving institutions, and also look at the nature of how work experience during your time in higher education actually does support you in order to gain a job afterwards. And where those graduate work sort of experience and opportunities happens is probably not in the institutions that you might well imagine, and that's not also made well known to applicants to the point of choosing where to go.
Yes, sir.
Very difficult to be brief. I feel there's something missing. You're grappling with very important and difficult problems. But it reminded me of yesterday when I was running a conference on history of mathematics and philosophy and science. And you see people in the sort of 16th century struggling with things and really deadly earnest, but getting it what we would call wrong. You've left out the deliverance, that is, poor, blasted infantry, the academics. You focus on listening, but not listening to the providers, listening to the customers. It can't work. The customers are, as you might want to call them, are 18 mostly, despite Nicola's statistics. And they really haven't a clue. If you ask them, is your difficulty because you're thick, or because you don't work, or because you're not given enough feedback, which one are they going to choose? They don't understand feedback, they don't use the feedback they get. But what we have are large administrative systems running around trying to answer the important questions which are put to them. And they focus on feedback, because that on the National Student Survey sort of comes out not so high. I mean, if you worry about information, advice and guidance, yes, it tells you something. It tells you that schools don't actually know what they're preparing kids for. But if you really think that's the problem, you will create another connections. Now, I cannot say whether connections was a good thing for the bottom half, but it seemed to get lumbered with the top half job as well, and it didn't really know what to do with it.
the bottom half of
pay in
what-
universities. Well, maybe it did, but I suspect it wasn't academic pay. There is a huge growth industry which you're in danger of talking to exclusively, which is administration. I spent yesterday running a conference on the history of mathematics and science. I spent today trying to milk a 10-year-old photocopier. Because tomorrow morning, I've got 3 classes of 200 kids, and the administrative structure at the low level, at the chalk face, is appalling. So please, I know it's difficult if you're answering very big questions of state. Please try to get an input from the chalk face if you can. And please do the professionals who've been at it for a very long time with a little more respect than the clients who are 18 and who, in the old-fashioned view of universities, were actually there to learn from the people who knew something. So please try and get it around the right way. It's difficult, I know.
Nicola, how would Universities UK respond to that?
I hope universities would always treat academics with respect, and if they aren't, they should. But I think it's absolutely clear to me that in terms of teaching, the teaching function of universities, they have to listen to students. They would be insane not to, and they do. I mean, that's the only way you can look at this, that this is now a student-driven engagement, and that particularly if students are contributing more, or rather graduates are contributing more, then it is absolutely essential that their voice is central to what it is that's provided. But can I flag up one area where I am hugely sympathetic to what you're saying, and that's partly a reflection from what we've seen developing in the States as a very market-driven model, and that's the question of grade inflation. I think this is something we've really got to engage with. If you have a very student-stroke-market-driven model, there's a real danger that academics feel obliged to increase the grades of their graduates, because nothing can be more damaging, I guess, in terms of student feedback than a student who's really fed up at having been marked down, or even worse, got a lower mark in their degree than they anticipated, and therefore the feedback is negative. And I think if you have if the model is too much orientated to the student and not enough orientated around academic input into what are objective academic standards, then you end up playing too much to a student market and a graduate market, and that can lead to quite dangerous distortions, particularly in relation to grade inflation. As I say, that's one of the areas that's real concern in the States, and I think we need to be very careful that we don't import that into this country. But I'm certainly clear on behalf of universities that we can respect academics, but most importantly listen to students, and I absolutely don't accept that 18-year-olds, who are after all adults, don't have absolutely legitimate and well-informed opinions, and incidentally 18-year-olds are probably now a minority amongst students anyway, so I think it's a slightly false argument that's being set up there.
Sean, how would UUP, how are you engaging with the academics as much as you're engaging in getting the views of the students?
Well, basically, our focus is very much on non-core
Yes.
facilities. I do have a spare photocopier if you want a second. But I think it's important for us to create the correct environment in terms of the actual quality of the infrastructure of the buildings. We've done a few academic buildings in UPP and also designed the administrative backup to actually run those facilities, and it does make a very large difference if you actually do it properly. I think in terms of the private sector, very much recognise that it's not our area of expertise to provide teaching and research. That's what academics do. They're incredibly good at it. They need to be supported by the right kind of investment and infrastructure around them.
With the greatest of respect, I'll answer your. Well, it's a good.
Well, the politeness is spreading.
Here we go. I think there's an extent to which you may have missed the purpose of higher education. I say this rather boldly, as someone with an undergraduate degree. But what for me separates out higher education to anything that comes before it is the very engagement between staff and students. And why higher education shouldn't have a teacher-pupil relationship as what comes before it is because I think I got the most out of the particular modules I was studying in, when I feel that I could really engage and ask searching questions, challenging questions in a polite and fair way of the academic staff. That's how I felt I was actually starting to really gain knowledge. And I feel that that's best represented in a model of co-production where together students and staff should be helping students to extend the boundaries of knowledge. And I think to kind of describe higher education along the outdated description that I felt that you put forward is patronising to people that choose to go into higher education, and actually means that people leave higher education having achieved a lot less. And I would much rather see a student body wanting, in the right way, to feel like they can challenge staff to help themselves get more out of their higher education experience. And I would really hope that we would be working with staff to allow us to do that. I can't quite comment on the connections thing because I wasn't sure quite what you meant by the top half and the bottom half. And I'll leave you to say whether you want to elaborate that more or not.
David, would you like to?
Yeah, and then I'm afraid I have to go for another meeting. What is your discipline? Are you a mathematician, scientist? Mathematician. You see, and I think that may help explain this interesting debate between Aaron and yourself, because Aaron studied English, and I suspect people studying English reach earlier the position where there is an open debate about one's interpretation and assessment of a particular work of art. I think in maths, it's unlikely for an undergraduate to get to the cutting edge of maths where the theoretical innovations are occurring and where there are open questions. I suspect much more of maths study at university is still the student absorbing a body of knowledge that has already been accumulated, where there are indeed answers that are correct and incorrect. And so I draw from this, I think there is an interesting challenge about market type relationships and professional tutoring type relationships. I don't think they're unique in higher education, but I think they're also, I think the variable of the discipline you're studying is also important. And I do apologise.
Before you, are there any other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
I have one. So my name's Pearl. I'm a district councillor at Aylesbury Vale, and I also work for the Vice Chancellor at the University of Buckingham, which is the private. I just wanted to ask, if tuition fees go up, then presumably it's fair to cut some ties with government and allow universities to be freer in what they spend their money on and how they manage themselves. And if that happens, perhaps that's a way for the student experience to increase and things get better. Would that be a fair comment to make?
Yeah, well, what I would say is that certainly if universities are receiving less money from government, then I think they should be less dependent on having to answer to government. But what's important is then how do they respond to, presumably it'll be students, graduates, sort out, having to pay more. So how can universities clearly be answerable to students and student representative structures? But the other point I would make as well is that I do actually think there is a public confidence issue, even if it is graduates having to pay more. And so in some respects, even if it's graduates paying something, the benefits which higher education deliver aren't just confined to the individual. Actually, we need a well-funded higher education sector, whether that comes from the individual or whether that comes from the state, in terms of meeting the long-term economic objectives of the country. I would argue for reasons of culture, for reasons of social cohesion, for all the other benefits that a well-educated adult population brings to society. And so so I can see where you're coming from, But I think in some respects universities will still need to be answerable, but it may be in a different form and to a different audience. But universities shouldn't feel like they're going to just be let off the hook if state funding looks like it's going to be dramatically reduced, as we're hearing it may be.
Would you like to respond?
Yes, just 2 quick points really. I don't disagree with anything Aaron has said there, and I think that's a really interesting question. One of the issues, I think, is the cap on student numbers. And if there is a deregularisation and effectively a disinvestment by the state, I would hope that that could go hand in hand with a lifting of the cap on student numbers, which is what stopped so many universities from recruiting students that they really wanted to recruit. So I think that's one area where deregularisation would be very welcome. And just to stand back a bit from that, and this is reflecting the point that Aaron's made, there is a public interest in the quality of higher education though, and I think the state removing itself entirely without any system for ensuring the maintenance of quality would be a very dangerous world in which to exist. And so I think we have to look at that question, which I think is a very good question, and I'm sure that many Vice-Chancellors would welcome a lifting of some of the bureaucratic controls. But I think we have to look at that question in the context of making sure that the overall quality of UK higher education, which is phenomenally high, it has an international standing, does not get damaged. And I think that does involve some oversight either by the state or at least making sure that there are systems in place to make sure that that doesn't get abused or doesn't deteriorate.
Yes, please.
Just to reiterate that, the reality is that universities in this country, we actually train and teach and prepare pillars of this country. Effectively, your teachers, your doctors, your lawyers, your radiographers, your paramedical scientists. This is absolutely crucial. I'm James Seymour. I'm head of student recruitment or UK recruitment at Aston University. Also welcome to our city, by the way. You're all very welcome. I think I'll reiterate my colleague here's point in terms of IAG, information, advice and guidance. Increasingly, universities are doing that themselves actually in terms of our schools and colleges days and activities that we do. And we welcome getting involved in that, to be honest. And again, lots of universities are spending part of their additional fee income on activities to do with outreach and raising aspirations, but also managing expectations among students, I think is quite important too. Part of the reason why so many students didn't choose to go to university this year was because they had this perception that they have to go to a so-called top university. And what does a top university mean? It's often the university that spends the most on, and possibly on kind of,
research,
claiming it's a top university, rather than actually, does it actually offer an amazing experience? And I think we need to get away from that in terms of both the Brown Review, but also generally in terms of where we take this forward. There's pockets of absolute world-class excellence, both in teaching and research, across a massive range of universities. And that needs to be made clear both to the Minister, of course, isn't it, left, but also to our young people and their teachers and their parents too, who increasingly have influence. We almost live now in a world where the reality of choosing school for the last 18, 20 years has been so important as parents. We often have increasing influence on their offspring too, when they are 18, which is because that's absolutely crucial. So this is absolutely fundamental. And I just reiterate too, we are here to inspire and to prepare and the journey that students take between arriving, especially those who are 18, but also the increasing numbers of mature students too. It's an incredible journey they take, and we should be incredibly proud of that too. And that's my point.
Thank you.
And all I'd say to that, which is why I think it is so disheartening and ultimately self-defeating that this government is pursuing cuts in the region of 40% to our universities for what it does. I think it is utterly counterproductive. I just think that there can be no apology for that, for all the reasons that you laid out in your point.
Question at the back.
It's a slightly different question, but there have been a few references over the last few minutes to the benefits of university beyond just training people academically, but in terms of contributing to local communities, to social cohesion and so on, and also to access to America, where sort of civic engagement is a much higher priority on most university agendas. Some of the top institutions in America, it's one of their sort of core missions. I was wondering what the panel thought about sort of universities of a big society almost, and what possibilities there are that universities perhaps do more in terms of engaging society and almost enslaving themselves to the government, and that they actually do have a huge role to play in tackle some of the really serious issues that we have in the country.
I totally agree. Universities have a huge role to play in terms of civic engagement, and that's something that's emerging more and more loudly and more clearly. And the only reason I didn't touch on it was that it wasn't the ostensible theme of this really important debate today. But I mean, I think there is no university that's not integrated in its community, however you define that community. It can be an international one, it can be a very local one. And that role, I think, is something we've got to get very much better at communicating and selling, and I think there's a real challenge there actually, because for many, just take a regional or local communities, if the university wasn't there, that region would collapse, quite frankly. Huge employer, huge engagement with local industries, which often sustains way beyond the region, and also the more intangible civic engagement in terms of some of the cultural events that support the community and the outreach into schools. I mean, I could go on for hours on this, so I better stop, but I totally agree.
Sean, that would fit in with some of the pastoral care issues which you're talking about in the community.
No, I agree. I think it's a very blunt instrument if you just measure the contribution a graduate makes to society in purely fiscal terms. I think that's a mistake. I think there's been quite a lot of research done on the subject, and I think if you are a graduate and you're educated, you make a much more positive contribution to society and those around you. I think you're a lot more stable, a lot healthier, and it's for the good of society as a whole. And actually, universities themselves, when you actually go to university towns, often universities are the focus of those towns, and they underpin all the local economies and employment from it. So I agree entirely that universities do need to be adequately funded going forward, because they are pivotal to society.
Thank you for that. Perhaps I'll call a formal end to proceedings there. Our panellists will be around. There's wine and some nibbles at the back. Please do help yourselves. Can I thank each of our panellists? David is just left, but can I thank each of them for taking the time to come along? And thank you all again for coming as well. Thank you.